Welcome to this course on Introduction to Python Programming for Beginners. Here's Module 1. We'll first take a look at the introduction and the course agenda. In our first lesson, I'll talk about the course agenda, which means the various modules and lessons within the Python programming. This is a beginner's course, so you don't need any experience in programming. I'm going to introduce you to the basic programming concepts and then take you step by step by means of tutorials, and we'll do both. We'll do concepts and then we'll apply those concepts by means of a tutorial, and that's the best way to learn. And then in lesson 2 we will highlight some of the areas as to why do programming, what is programming all about, and the basics of flowchart and logic as well. So just introducing you to the programming end of things, and of course later we'll get into the actual Python program. We'll also discuss what Python is and so on. But in this first module, I'll just introduce some of the basic concepts of programming and then take you through the course agenda as well. In module 2, we'll get into the basics of Python. This module has 7 lessons. Lesson 1 is downloading Python. So from scratch, I'll demonstrate how to get hold of Python, what is Python, where do you go find it, how do you download it, whether on a Macintosh computer or on your Windows machine. I'll explain the various steps that are required in downloading Python and some of the prerequisites as well. So I'll highlight some of the areas to download Python and what does it come with. In other words, what does the package has, what are the various features of Python program itself. Lesson 2 is the Python interpreter and idle. These are the two elements that get installed when you install Python on your computer. So once the installation is complete, I will demonstrate the use of Python interpreter and then the idle. What these are, what they do, what are the various functions of the interpreter and the idle. Lesson 3 is Python expressions. This is where we'll get into some of the language elements of Python. I'll just give you the flavor of what Python expressions are. Lesson 4 are Python strings. So for instance, if you need to write some text within the program, how do you go about doing it? What does it look like? What does it do? And why do we do this? And explain in lesson 4. And lesson 5 is getting input. For instance, if you're working or writing a program, you have to provide an input to the program so that it does something for us. So we'll take a look at what getting input means in lesson 5. In lesson 6, it's all about reading and writing files. Fetch a file from the computer and open it, for example, and other features will be covered within this lesson. In lesson 7 is the nuts and bolts and starting the idle. So in this lesson, I will explain the actual interface itself, what each line means. So I'm going to open up a sample program and I'm going to demonstrate various parts of the program. For instance, there may be certain code that may be in different color, for example, or that performs a certain function. So I'll explain to you what those elements are so you get familiar with the interface itself, which is called the idle within the Python. So module 2 overall, you'll be familiar with the basics of Python before you can actually start getting into and start coding or programming within the Python language. Module 3 is integer arithmetic, has 3 lessons. So lesson 1 is creating your first program. So in the previous module, we would have covered the basics of Python. In the first lesson in this module, we'll take a look at how to create our first program. A simple program, just so that you get a flavor and understanding of how to write a simple program in Python. Lesson 2 is placing comments in code. So in this lesson, I'll demonstrate line by line how to place comments within your code. In other words, these comments are simply that tells the programmer or another user or a person taking a look at your program or your code as to understand what you're actually about to do within your program. So these are just like placing comments and you do the same within your Word document. For example, if you're using a word processing program, you place comments for other users so they can understand your code better. Lesson 3 is Introduction to Strings. We'll get into more into strings, how to use strings within your Python program. Module 4 is Functions and Variables. So moving forward in this module, which has 4 lessons, the first lesson is what are functions. So we'll define what functions are, what do they do, how do they store values, what's the purpose of a function, why do we need them within the Python language programming. Lesson 2 is the print function, by far the most common function. So for example, if you tell a program to do something, then you need to also tell a program to print the output or the results as well. So we'll explore the print function in lesson 2. Lesson 3 and 4 are escape codes and the input function. And once again, these are simply a step forward within our programming as we go about creating a program, and then we enhance our programming, enhance our logic by using the escape codes, and of course the input function, which implies that, for instance, you may want to write a code where you would prompt a user to enter something. Use a certain software, you click on something, and it prompts you to enter your username. So that's basically the input function behind the scenes. So in module 4, we'll talk about the concept of functions and variables. Module 5 is function definition. This has 5 lessons. First is global variables, how to define global variables and what they are and what they do. Lesson 2 is the concept of dictionaries. And lesson 3 is concept of lists. And these are, again, you define a certain set of values and then you use code and use those values. And lesson 4 are what are tuples. These are very similar to lists. In fact, they are kind of lists. The only difference is between lists and a tuple is that you cannot change the tuple unless you change it back to a list and then you create a tuple again. So I'll explain later on, once we get into these lessons, what's the purpose and why do we use these. And lesson 5 is Introduction to Loops. And this is important because loops are inevitably more important as you program things. For instance, if you were to play a number game, the first prompt or the input is enter a number that you want to guess. And if you guess the number incorrect, then it was going to prompt you again for a number, a new number. And once again, you enter that number, and if that number is also incorrect, the software or the program is going to prompt you again to enter the number, and you'll keep repeating the steps until you find the correct number or you enter the correct number. So that's what a loop is all about. So until and unless you find the correct value, the software or the code is going to keep looping around until the result is finalized. So we'll take a look at the loops in lesson 5. Module 6 is object orientation. We'll get into more in lesson 1 about graphics. Lesson 2 is conditional execution. Lesson 3 is if statements. And again, these are more conditional logic. So for instance, if it was going to rain, I need to take an umbrella, right? So that's just a simple English statement that if something happens, then I will do something else, right? So if, then, else is a basic logic that we use in programs, Python programming language, or we write the code and letting the software know that, hey, we need something done, here's our conditional logic. So we'll explore the concept of if statements and additional if statements, which means they're nested within if statements. So there will be multiple if statements. And lesson 5 is the while loop. So while is again wait and then loop around to do something. So module 6 is about object orientation. And module 7 is about projects. I've listed a couple of lessons here, project A and project B, which simply means that we will do from scratch, we will create certain projects using Python. So maybe we'll create a number game, we'll create some other games, for example, in Python, or do some other programming that may help you within your work environment. So we'll explore by using and creating from scratch a couple of projects, and I might create other projects as well, even though I've listed a couple of lessons, but I may end up doing, for practice purposes, additional lessons within this module as well. And all of the modules are reinforced within these projects. And finally, in module 8, we will conclude, and the course conclusion will cover essentially recapping all the concepts, all the lessons that we've covered within the Python programming. The objective here is to ensure that you not only understand the basics of programming and why we program, but also how to program and using Python language. So in conclusion, we will recap essentially all of the important concepts that we already covered. So without further ado, let's get into our first module and explore various lessons. The entire course is about concepts and then applying those concepts using Python interpreter and idle. So we'll explore and I'll demonstrate by hands-on tutorials how to understand a certain concept and then how to apply it and how to see the output. What does it do? So let's get started and let's begin our first module.